I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My dad's voice, calm but firm, cut through the air like a knife. "You shouldn't be at the wedding," he said. And for a moment, I thought I must have misheard him. I looked at him, searching for a flicker of hesitation. But there was none, just the same cold certainty that had been a constant in our family. The unspoken rules I had learned to navigate since childhood. My heart raced, a mixture of shock and confusion swirling inside me. Why now? Why this wedding of all events? I had imagined walking in, smiling at relatives, seeing familiar faces celebrating love, not being turned away before it even began. I tried to find a thread of reason in his eyes, something that could make sense. But all I saw was the same favoritism, the same invisible line that had always separated me from my siblings. The hurt was immediate, raw, and familiar, like a wound I hadn't realized was still bleeding. I wanted to argue, to remind him of everything I had done, everything I had sacrificed. But the words felt heavy, useless, swallowed by the weight of his disapproval. The room seemed smaller, the air tighter. As the realization sank in, I was not wanted here. The very people I had counted on to celebrate with me were the ones pushing me out. My chest tightened, and a cold anger began to replace the initial shock. This wasn't just about a wedding. It was a confirmation of a pattern I had spent years trying to ignore. As I stared at him, I realized that tonight, like so many nights before, I would have to navigate the humiliation, the subtle yet undeniable rejection, and decide how far I was willing to let it go or whether it was finally time to take back some control. The tension in the house was palpable, a mix of unspoken rules and family hierarchy that I had always tried to respect. But tonight it threatened to crush me. And yet, beneath the hurt, a flicker of something else stirred an awareness that this moment, as painful as it was, might be the spark that changed everything. I couldn't help but remember all the little moments that had led to this point, the quiet injustices I had carried for years. At every family gathering, I was always the one overlooked, the birthday gifts subtly smaller, the compliments half-hearted, the good job delivered with a sigh that seemed meant for someone else. I remembered my sister graduating top of her class, my parents fawning over her accomplishments, while I stood in the corner, praised politely but never truly celebrated. Even simple gestures, like handing me the dinner plate last or pretending not to notice my achievements, cut deeper than anyone could see. It wasn't just about being ignored. It was about feeling invisible in the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. The memory of my cousins wedding last year came back vividly, the smiles directed at everyone else, the whispers I caught about how I never quite fit in, the way my aunt subtly reminded me I owed her for everything she had done for me, as if my existence itself was a debt. There were countless moments, my high school awards ceremony, when my parents cheered louder for my brother, my promotion that was met with a polite nod while my sister got a champagne toast, the holidays when I was handed the leftovers while someone else got the centerpiece of attention. Each incident seemed small on its own, almost dismissible, but strung together, they formed a web of neglect and favoritism that had shaped me, eroded my self-esteem, and left me constantly questioning my worth. I had tried to shrug them off, to convince myself that love wasn't measured in fanfare or recognition. But the pattern was undeniable, a constant reminder that I had never truly been their favorite. And tonight, standing on the threshold of this wedding, the culmination of their subtle but persistent biases, the resentment that had simmered silently for years surged forward. It wasn't just about being told to leave. It was about every single moment that had led me here, every slight I had swallowed, every opportunity they had quietly stolen from me. The memories were sharp, painful, but they also ignited a clarity I had never allowed myself. I could no longer be the quiet one, the overlooked one, the one who always stepped aside. This wedding, this confrontation, felt like the first real chance to claim the recognition and respect I had been denied for so long. Later that evening, I finally got a hold of the wedding guest list, and as I scrolled through it, my heart skipped in ways I didn't expect. Names jumped off the page, familiar and intimidating all at once. People I had seen in magazines, heard about in business circles, and even some old flames I hadn't thought about in years. There were CEOs, socialites, and family friends who wielded influence I could only dream of. My eyes lingered on my father's colleagues, men and women whose opinions carried weight in ways I had never dared to challenge. Even some distant cousins, long estranged, had apparently been invited, likely with the intention of showing off wealth and status. I could practically feel the power dynamic shift in that room without even stepping foot in it. It was as if the guest list itself whispered opportunities, hints of leverage I could wield if I played my cards right. Thoughts began racing. What if I could turn their underestimation into advantage? What if the very people my father wanted to impress could witness the truth about who I had become, who I really was, and who he had dismissed for so long? The curiosity was intoxicating, mixing with a flicker of hope I hadn't allowed myself in years. This wedding, which had been presented as a stage for humiliation, suddenly appeared to me as a battlefield of potential power. I imagined casual conversations that would leave impressions, subtle reveals that would hint at wealth, success, and confidence. Even old acquaintances who once doubted me could become unexpected allies in the delicate dance of social dynamics. The excitement bubbled beneath the surface, mingling with the hurt and betrayal I already carried, creating a tension that demanded action. For the first time, the wedding wasn't just a reminder of what I had lacked, it was an opportunity to rewrite the narrative, to take the very eyes that had judged me and show them exactly what they had missed. When the shock settled, something colder took its place, a slow, steady anger that felt more honest than the tears had. I sat alone in my car, hands tight on the wheel, replaying Dad's words until they blurred into a long list of every time I'd been diminished. The humiliation tasted metallic, sharp, like biting down on a regret I had been trained to swallow. I had always smiled while they toasted someone else, laughed when their jokes excluded me, and learned to smooth the edges of my disappointment so no one else would have to notice. I hadn't wanted to be dramatic. I wanted fairness. But fairness wasn't the language they spoke. They gave me the script of the grateful, quiet child while applause went elsewhere. Realizing I had accepted that role for so long stung harder than any single insult. The wedding, with its pearls and speeches and carefully curated guest list, suddenly looked like a stage where I was expected to play my small part. My anger was not chaotic. It was measured, like a coiled spring. I began to catalog slights, not to drown in them, but to map out where the leverage lay. The landlord who'd laughed at my suggestion, but later gave my father a contract. The old colleague who still owed my uncle a favor. The influencer who remembered the time I stepped in when their life unraveled. Names and moments stacked in my head like chess pieces. I could see conversations that would unsettle them, questions that would nudge secrets into light, small moves that would tilt the room without anyone noticing at first. Guilt flickered, not for my anger, but for the childish hope that people I loved would simply love me back. That wish felt naive now, but its absence explained a lot. The betrayal was more than being excluded from a ceremony. It was the daily erosion of care, the small erasures that made me feel invisible. That pain sharpened the plan. I told myself the retaliation would not be mean-spirited. It would be precise and principled, aimed at revealing truth rather than inflicting shame for its own sake. Ideas arrived in fragments. A well-timed reveal, a casually shared document, a conversation with the person whose opinion held sway. Each fragment seemed plausible and potent. I pictured walking into the room with quiet confidence and letting the social chemistry change around me, like a tide that slowly shifted the sand they built their little beaches on. The thought of watching their smug faces soften into alarm felt like a promise. I replayed small rituals that had taught me my place. My mother rearranging photo frames to favor my sister, the way guests' applause always leaned towards someone else, the whispered promises about a future that never included me. Even when I succeeded, it was as if they substituted my name with a more convenient one. Those memories cut, but they also sharpened my purpose. This was not about revenge for revenge's sake. It was about dismantling the script they had written for me and exposing the false narrative they protected for years. By the time I started the engine, the notion had edges. This would not be impulse. It would be deliberate. Dad's dismissal had lit the match, but I would control the fire. I would return to that wedding on my terms, unashamed and unbowed, and make them confront the person they had always underestimated. By the next morning, I realized that raw anger alone wouldn't be enough. If I wanted to turn this humiliation round, I needed a plan subtle, precise, and impossible to ignore. I started with research, scrolling through the guest list again, mapping connections, recalling favors, debts, and reputations. Each name was a potential lever, someone whose attention could shift perception or spark curiosity. I imagined casual interactions that hinted at achievements they hadn't known I possessed. Status symbols carefully displayed, remarks dropped like breadcrumbs for those who underestimated me. I reached out quietly to old contacts, people I had helped in the past or whose opinions carried weight with my family, explaining nothing directly, letting them know I would be attending. Their excitement, curiosity, and subtle hints of anticipation began to create the first ripple of social proof. The idea that I was no longer just the overlooked one started to solidify, and even the thought of being underestimated began to work in my favor. Next, I planned small visual cues to assert authority without drawing immediate hostility. A professional recommendation here, a subtle mention of a promotion there, a careful flaunt of achievements I knew my father would notice. Every detail was designed to generate FOMO among family members. What had they missed? What had they assumed about me that was wrong? The tension between their assumptions and the reality I was preparing to reveal felt deliciously empowering. I even imagined conversations where influential guests would casually acknowledge my success, planting seeds in the minds of those who had laughed or dismissed me in the past. Status tension became a tool. I wasn't just showing up, I was recalibrating perceptions, proving that being overlooked for so long had not diminished me, that sharpened my ability to navigate their social drain. Every move I envisioned was like a chess piece, placed with intention, aiming for a reveal that would feel natural yet devastating to anyone who had underestimated me. By the time I finished outlining every step, I felt a strange mixture of nerves and exhilaration. I wasn't merely reacting anymore, I was orchestrating a scenario where my power, confidence, and achievements would speak for themselves. This wedding, meant to humiliate me, was about to become the stage where I quietly, decisively claimed my due. The anticipation alone made my pulse quicken, and for the first time in years, I felt completely in control of the story I had always been written out of. The days leading up to the wedding were a careful dance. Outwardly, I smiled, accepted invitations, and chatted politely, acting the part they expected of me, the quiet, agreeable family member who wouldn't make waves. Inside, every gesture, every laugh was measured. I memorized faces, tones, and subtle shifts in body language, cataloging who would notice what, who would take cues from whom. The contrast between my composed exterior and the simmering calculations in my mind was exhausting, but exhilarating. At family dinners, I nodded as Dad complimented my sister, laughed at their jokes, and pretended the pointed comparisons didn't sting. The room buzzed with anticipation, everyone focused on the spectacle of the wedding, yet I could see cracks in their confidence, glances that lingered too long, murmurs that betrayed unease. My observant eyes caught my mother rearranging the seating chart, perhaps unaware that I noticed, or perhaps thinking she was clever in her subtle control. Even as I outwardly conformed, I quietly tested the waters. Casual comments dropped into conversation hinted at accomplishments, successes, or connections they might have overlooked. The tension of hiding my true intentions while watching their reactions gave me a strange satisfaction, a quiet thrill that this performance of obedience would soon invert into revelation. I could see the unspoken hierarchy shifting subtly. Their smiles were polished, but there was an undercurrent of doubt, a faint sense that their assumptions about me might be challenged. Every day was a study in contrasts, the warm public facade masking the private contempt. the laughter concealing judgment, the pleasantries overlaying old resentments. I kept meticulous mental notes of who underestimated me, who assumed I would remain powerless, who might be swayed by evidence of the truth. With each encounter, my plan solidified, and the anticipation of the wedding grew, each polite nod and smile setting the stage for the moment when control would finally flip. The calm before the storm wasn't serene, it was charged, electric. A delicate balancing act where every small observation and every careful word carried the potential to reshape the evening entirely. When I pulled up to the venue, the sleek black car gliding smoothly along the driveway, I could already feel the shift in energy. My heart pounded, equal parts exhilaration and nerves, but my expression remained composed. The dress I had chosen was elegant, commanding without being ostentatious, a subtle declaration that I had arrived not as the overlooked one, but as someone whose presence demanded attention. Every detail, from the shimmer of my earrings to the careful selection of shoes, was intentional. I wanted them to see me not the shy, compliant child they thought I was, but a confident, capable adult who had quietly built her own world. As I stepped out, my father's face registered the shock I had anticipated. The corners of his mouth tightened, a brief flicker of doubt crossing his eyes before he tried to mask it with a stiff smile. My sister, who had always hovered in the spotlight, faltered in her greeting, a hesitation in her tone that betrayed her unease. I offered polite, measured smiles, letting the subtle tension linger. "I hope I'm not too early," I said, voice calm but carrying an edge that immediately drew attention. The small crowd of guests nearby shifted, some glancing at me with curiosity, others whispering quietly among themselves. I caught snippets of my father muttering under his breath, a barely audible "I didn't expect," before his words dissolved into forced composure. Each reaction was exactly what I had imagined, the cracks in their confidence widening as they realized this was not the same person they had underestimated for years. My sister attempted a casual greeting, the rehearsed friendliness thin and strained. "I didn't think you'd be coming," she said, trying to mask surprise with casual tones. I tilted my head, letting a small, knowing smile play across my lips. "Well, I wouldn't miss it," I replied, letting the words float with a mix of charm and quiet defiance. Each carefully measured interaction was a test, a way to establish presence while planting the seeds of doubt. Inside, the air felt different. Conversations paused subtly as my rival became the pivot round which attention gravitated. My father tried to maintain control, issuing polite instructions to staff, but even his gestures seemed smaller, constrained. I moved through the room, exchanging brief nods and greetings, letting my settled confidence unsettle the family without overt confrontation. The juxtaposition between the smiles they offered and the tension I could sense beneath them was almost intoxicating. Every whispered comment, every subtle glance, reinforced the power shift I had been meticulously preparing. By the time the first speeches began, I felt the tide turning imperceptibly, but undeniably. I hadn't acted aggressively. I hadn't announced my intentions. I had simply arrived, poised, radiant, and fully visible. And yet, the shock factor was undeniable. The quiet, internal realization in their eyes that the underestimated child was no longer theirs to dismiss. That the evening was about to unfold in ways they had never imagined. As the evening progressed, I moved through the crowd with deliberate ease, letting my presence register without demanding it. I lingered near influential guests, engaging in light conversation that hinted at accomplishments and connections they hadn't expected me to have. A brief mention of a recent project, a shared anecdote with a distant cousin who knew my father's colleagues. A compliment returned in a way that implied knowledge and influence, all carefully calculated to signal competence and social weight. I watched reactions closely, noting who registered surprise, who adjusted their posture, and who began to whisper to others. My father's eyes flicked toward me more often than before, each glance sharper, heavier. I could see the subtle tension in his jaw, the brief stiffening of his shoulders, as if the room itself were reminding him that his assumptions about me were no longer valid. Even my sister, whose confidence had always been bolstered by her position in the family hierarchy, now hesitated in conversations, glancing at me as if measuring whether my presence might eclipse hers. It wasn't overt confrontation, there was no shouting or dramatics, but the shift in dynamics was palpable. The social leverage I had quietly cultivated was becoming visible, like ripples on water that disturbed the reflection of those around me. Guests who had assumed I was merely a footnote in the family drama now leaned in, eager to acknowledge or connect, their reactions hinting at curiosity and admiration. Each interaction reinforced the contrast, the polite smiles I gave them, the careful attention to social cues, and the subtle revelations about my life created a tension that neither my father nor sister could openly dismiss. By the time the next toast was announced, I could feel the room subtly recalibrating, a recognition of presence that I had earned without ever raising my voice. Their unease was quiet, but unmistakable, a small tremor of doubt in the foundation they had built around underestimating me. The tide was shifting, and I was at the center, fully aware and fully in control. As the evening reached its midpoint, I knew it was time for a subtle yet undeniable display. During casual conversation with a small group of influential guests, I mentioned an upcoming venture I had quietly spearheaded, one that involved partnerships with people my father respected, people whose approval he valued. Their eyes widened in recognition, and a ripple of murmurs spread across the room. I let the comments hang, allowing them to circulate, knowing the whispers would inevitably reach my father and sister. It wasn't boastful, it was measured. The kind of reveal that felt natural yet impossible to ignore. I watched as Dad's face twitched slightly, a flicker of disbelief betraying the carefully maintained composure he wore earlier. He tried to mask it with a polite cough, but the tension in his posture was unmistakable. Even my sister, usually quick to dominate conversations, hesitated mid-sentence, her eyes darting toward me as though she were recalculating her social footing. Guests who had assumed I was still the overlooked child now treated me with curiosity, respect, even admiration. The shift was quiet but piercing, and I could feel it in every glance, every half-smile, every raised eyebrow. Later, during a toast, I casually referenced a charitable initiative I had led, one that involved several of the family's closest friends. The room paused. The mention of my name elicited recognition, questions, and compliments I had rarely received before. My father's hand tightened around his glass, knuckles white, and I caught the almost imperceptible exchange between him and my sister, two people struggling to reconcile their assumptions with the reality unfolding in front of them. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it worked. The embarrassment was subtle yet real, creeping into their posture, the way they interacted with others, the forced smiles that no longer concealed tension. I could feel the balance shifting. The underestimation that had followed me for years was crumbling, replaced by a recognition of the power and status I had quietly built outside their gaze. The first shock had landed, and it was perfectly timed, leaving them unsettled, questioning, and vulnerable. As I sipped my drink and engaged politely with the next guest, I felt a quiet satisfaction. This was only the beginning, but the effect was immediate. Whispers, sideways glances, and tiny tremors of discomfort that confirmed my plan was working. For the first time that evening, the family hierarchy felt fragile, and I was beginning to see how high I could rise when I finally refused to be overlooked. By the time the main course was served, I could feel the shift in the room growing stronger. Dad's carefully maintained composure was cracking. The rigid posture, the polite nods, even the forced smiles betrayed the storm brewing beneath. His eyes flicked to me repeatedly, narrowing in disbelief, as if trying to reconcile the confident, composed woman before him with the child he had always dismissed. Every casual mention of my achievements, every subtle interaction that displayed influence or recognition, had landed with precision, and he knew it. My sister's reactions mirrored his unease. The ease she normally carried evaporated, replaced by a stiffness that made every word she spoke sound rehearsed. The glances she exchanged with our relatives were desperate, seeking validation or guidance, as if the room itself had shifted beneath her feet. Even extended family members, who had long assumed my quiet presence equaled in significance, began to glance my way with curiosity and restrained admiration. The contrast between their public composure and private panic was palpable, a tension that seemed to thrum through the room. I could sense Dad's mind racing, tracing each miscalculation, each time he had underestimated me, each assumption that had allowed me to remain invisible. The shame, anger, and disbelief were visible in micro-expressions or tightening jaw, a flicker of red in the face, a hand brushing nervously over the tablecloth. It was intoxicating to witness, a confirmation that the careful planning and subtle power plays were achieving their purpose. Even casual conversations became high stakes. Every interaction with influential guests subtly reinforced the reality that I was no longer the overlooked child. Dad's attempts to regain control were futile, each word, each gesture from him, and my sister seemed increasingly reactive, defensive, and out of step with the atmosphere I had cultivated. The tension escalated, a perfect storm of anticipation, pride, and disbelief, leaving the audience or anyone witnessing this on edge, fully immersed in the psychological power struggle unfolding in real time. By the time dessert arrived, the unspoken panic had reached its peak. The subtle tremors of recognition, the shifting attention, the quiet recalibration of respect all signaled a turning point. The underestimated child had become the center of attention, not through force or aggression, but through strategy, pace, and quiet authority. The audience felt it, to the suspense, the satisfaction, the anticipation of what would come next, knowing that the family's reckoning was only just beginning. The moment I had been building toward arrived with a quiet inevitability. As the room hummed with polite conversation, I waited for the perfect opening, the precise instant when all attention would naturally pivot toward me. I raised my glass, drawing just enough focus without appearing self-important, and let a small, deliberate pause hang in the air. Then, casually but clearly, I shared the news that would change the dynamics of the evening, a revelation about an inheritance arrangement my father had assumed would be secret, coupled with the acknowledgement of my own accomplishments that had quietly outpaced expectations for years. Gasps rippled through the room. The air seemed to tighten as whispers spread among the guests, eyes darting toward my father and sister, their carefully constructed world, one where I had always been the overlooked, undervalued child, collapsed under the weight of the information I had revealed. The shock in my father's expression was almost theatrical. The pallor, the sudden rigidity in his posture, the way his voice faltered when he tried to speak. My sister's usual smug composure crumbled. She stammered through a half-hearted attempt to regain footing. But the subtle social cues I had planted over the past days magnified my moment of triumph. I didn't raise my voice or demand attention. I let the facts speak for themselves. A few well-placed comments about collaborations, charitable endeavors, and long-term planning added context, demonstrating not only my success, but also my independence from the family's favoritism. Influential guests nodded, murmured congratulations, and exchanged looks that silently reinforced the magnitude of the revelation. My father's colleagues, whom I had strategically engaged earlier, offered polite, knowing smiles, further amplifying his discomfort. It was a carefully orchestrated symphony of social proof, status recognition, and truth exposure. The emotional weight in the room shifted palpably. Dad's face, once confident, was now marked by disbelief and shame. Every guest who had once overlooked me now recognized the authority and accomplishment I embodied. My sister, desperate to reclaim control, found herself floundering, her whispered side comments drowned out by the acknowledgement and admiration I had quietly cultivated. I watched, almost detached, as the people who had underestimated me scrambled to reassess, realizing the power and influence I had accumulated outside their oversight. The thrill of witnessing their public embarrassment was intense, but tempered by the satisfaction of justice rather than cruelty. Every gesture, the polite applause from guests, the subtle shifts in posture, the hesitant glances exchanged between family members served as confirmation that my plan had succeeded. This was not vengeance for vengeance's sake. It was the exposure of truth, the reclamation of respect and acknowledgement that had been denied to me for years. By the time the evening progressed, the reversal was complete. I had turned a potential humiliation into a moment of empowerment, carefully exposing favoritism and societal miscalculations in a way that no one could ignore. The family hierarchy, so rigid for decades, had been reshaped, if only for this moment, leaving my father and sister publicly confronted with the consequences of their underestimation. For the first time, the balance had shifted, and I could enjoy the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the person they had dismissed as powerless had orchestrated an elegant, undeniable triumph. The room buzzed with whispers, hushed conversations threading through the crowd as guests exchanged glances, processing what had just unfolded. I caught snippets of their comments: admiration, surprise, even quiet envy, all reinforcing the impact of my revelation. Each acknowledgement from those who had once underestimated me felt like a silent cheer, a validation of the years I had spent quietly building a life they assumed I couldn't. My father's face remained pale, his usual authority stripped away, replaced by a heavy awareness that he had misjudged me. My sister hovered uneasily, flustered and unsure, trying to mask embarrassment with forced smiles that only highlighted her discomfort. I noticed the subtle shifts, the polite nods from distant relatives, the appreciative murmurs from influential guests, and the hesitant glances exchanged between family members. It was a delicate symphony of acknowledgement, a social recalibration that placed me firmly at the center, the one whose presence could no longer be ignored. I let myself breathe in the moment, savoring the satisfaction that was both personal and karmic. Every slight, every overlooked effort, every whispered dismissal over the years had culminated in this vindication. It wasn't about revenge, it was about justice, about showing that neglect, favoritism, and underestimation had consequences. I replayed each subtle move I had made, the conversations with key guests, the carefully timed mentions of achievements, the poised confidence I carried as I walked into the room. Each action had contributed to this perfect alignment of recognition, timing, and social impact. A quiet smile curved my lips as I reflected internally, realizing how far I had come. The humiliation I had anticipated never arrived. Instead, I stood in a space where my dignity and capability were undeniable. The subtle murmurs of approval, the shifting dynamics, and the discomfort of those who had dismissed me all combined into a powerful affirmation. This was more than social victory, it was the resolution of old wounds, a testament to patience, strategy, and self-worth that, as I watched the family navigate the aftermath, I felt a calm satisfaction, a sense of justice that was both personal and universal. Karma had played its part, and I had orchestrated the circumstances to reveal the truth without malice, leaving the audience, if they were watching, fully immersed in the emotional payoff. The whispers, the glances, and the subtle recalibration of respect were proof that years of invisibility had ended. I had claimed the acknowledgement I deserved, and the ripple of recognition and unease in the room confirmed that the moment had landed perfectly. As the evening wound down, I found a quiet corner to breathe, letting the events of the night settle over me. Pride and vindication pulsed through every thought. I had executed my plan flawlessly, claimed my space, and finally been seen for who I truly was. The admiration from guests, the subtle recognition, the recalibrated glances of my father and sister, all of it affirmed the power I had quietly accumulated and the justice I had earned. For the first time, I felt genuinely empowered and tethered from the assumptions that had weighed me down for years. And yet, beneath the triumph was a lingering ache, the pain of knowing that those who were supposed to love and support me had spent decades underestimating, dismissing, and subtly undermining me could not be erased. Their favoritism, their blind spots, their inability to recognize my worth until forced by circumstance. These truths left a quiet sadness that clung even to my victory. The emotional complexity of the night, the blend of power and hurt, justice and betrayal, was a weight I hadn't anticipated, but accepted as part of the story. I allowed myself a small, reflective smile, acknowledging that life was rarely purely fair or entirely cruel. I had rewritten my narrative, reclaimed my dignity, and exposed the truth without resorting to cruelty. But the emotional scars of neglect remained. The lesson was clear: validation and empowerment could be claimed, but familial betrayal often leaves invisible marks that lingered. As I stepped out into the cold night air, I felt both the exhilaration of victory and the quiet resonance of loss. The world saw my triumph. I carried both the satisfaction of justice and the lingering sorrow of those who failed to recognize me. That delicate balance, the bitter and the sweet, was a truth the audience could feel, the emotional echo that would linger long after the last toast had faded, leaving them both satisfied and contemplative. As the night drew to a close, the atmosphere had shifted irrevocably. Conversations once dominated by my family's hierarchy now flowed around me, acknowledging my presence, my achievements, and my quiet authority. The relationships that had always been imbalanced were permanently altered. My father and sister now regarded me with cautious respect, aware that the underestimated child had claimed her space and refused to be ignored. Even distant relatives and influential guests offered nods and smiles that carried weight, subtle affirmations that I had risen above years of dismissal and favoritism. I stood tall, letting the satisfaction of the evening settle in, aware that this moment was about more than a single event. It was the culmination of strategy, patience, and self-belief, a declaration that I would no longer allow others' assumptions to define my worth. The power I had quietly cultivated outside their gaze had become visible, undeniable, and socially recognized. It wasn't arrogance, it was rightful acknowledgement, a moral and emotional triumph that could not be diminished. In those final moments, I reflected on the journey, the hurt endured, the calculated patience, and the courage to act with intelligence and dignity. Every slight, every moment of neglect had forged the resilience I now embodied. I understood that true empowerment wasn't in retaliation alone, but in the ability to claim recognition and respect without compromising integrity. As I stepped away from the crowd, I carried both the satisfaction of justice served and the quiet knowledge of my own self-worth. I had rewritten the story they thought they controlled, turning a night that began with exclusion into a lasting declaration of my place, my strength, and my value. The moral was clear: underestimation can be overcome, favoritism can be exposed, and dignity, once claimed, is unassailable. I walked into the night confident, empowered, and finally seen, leaving behind a lasting impression that would linger far beyond the final toast.